Next, from Springfield, Peggy Grande, a former aide to President Ronald Reagan, speaks to an audience at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library about her book, The President Will See You Now, which recounts her years spent with Ronald Reagan post-presidency. This runs about 40 minutes.
Wow, what a great turnout tonight. Thank you so much for coming out. I know we're all happy to just have air conditioning in here, but hopefully there's more reason than that as you came out tonight. It's truly an honor to be here. Thank you for that warm welcome and introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Now, we're going to start, I'm amongst friends, and so I have a story to tell, and I don't even think Alan knows this, but I have to confess, I was here once before. It was a few years back. I was driving through Illinois. I was doing a series of speeches. It was probably Ronald Reagan's birthday. It must have been an unseasonably warm February because I'm not in a big coat. But we were driving through Springfield, and the person who was driving me, we drove right past the Abraham Lincoln Library, and I said, "We have to stop." And he said, "We don't have time to stop." And I said, "But we have to stop. I can't be this close. This may be my only chance to ever come here. We have to stop." And so we stopped, and he said, "Okay, you have about 10 minutes, and then I had to call into a radio interview." And so I was a little nervous when I showed up because I thought my face might be in the front. Have you seen this woman? Because I did my radio from your coat closet. Oh my God. I had the gentleman who was driving me stand guard, and again, it must have been a warm February because there were no coats in the closet at the moment. And so here I am at my first visit, and I have to say my second visit was much better even so far. I've had the red carpet treatment, but I did start my roots here at the Abraham Lincoln Library in your coat closet, which is very nice, by the way. I don't know if you've been in there, but you should try it. Anyway, it is such a thrill and an honor to be here. You have no idea what a privilege it is to speak in this beautiful and special place. To have this great place in your backyard, how special it is. I was always that nerdy little kid that loved presidents and politics and government. And if you grew up in the Beltway of Washington, D.C., that might be a normal thing. But I grew up in Southern California, which might as well have been a million miles from Washington, D.C. But every single book I could get my hands on about presidents and politics and the White House and first ladies, I couldn't get enough. If you've ever seen the movie Beauty and the Beast, I was Belle, showing up at the Fanning Elementary School library. Do you have any new books yet today about presidents? Nope, I'm sorry, Peggy, you've read every book in our collection. So never could I have imagined that my life would take a turn and that my life and my love for presidents would ever actually intersect a president. But my dad raised me to believe that somebody's got to have the job you want, and it might as well be you. And so in college, I took a chance. Ronald Reagan had just left office. He returned to Los Angeles. I was a senior at Pepperdine University. I was a communications major. The great communicator had just left the White House and landed in my backyard. So I took a chance. I wrote a letter to the office of Ronald Reagan, never even expecting to hear from them. They called me in for an interview. I was interviewed by Selena Jackson, who actually, Paul is a friend of his who was here tonight. What a small world to have him here tonight. But I was interviewed, and the rest kind of became history. I will tell you, that first meeting of Ronald Reagan did probably not go quite as I had planned. You would think that a girl who had dreamed about meeting a president would be perfectly prepared if that happened. And again, we're amongst friends, and so I'm going to read a very embarrassing story from my book, but it's been published, so I've had to kind of get over the embarrassment of it. But you'll see why I was a little embarrassed. So I go in for my interview. I'm so excited. I'm so nervous. And I think if I could just step foot on Ronald Reagan's office floor, what a thrill of a lifetime that would be. I grew up in a family of educators, no connections to politics, and just never even considered the fact that my life would intersect his. So here's what happened. I went in for the interview. I thought it went fairly well. And as I was leaving, here's what happened. Waiting for her in the lobby felt almost like a dream state. It was so foreign to anything I had ever done or experienced, and yet somehow felt strangely familiar, as if this was all meant to be. The door nearest me suddenly swung open, and 4 Secret Service agents in suits and ties, with earpieces, radios, and guns holstered under their coats, walked hurriedly toward me. Did they know who I was? Did they know what I was doing there? Were they going to arrest me or shoot me? And then behind the lead agent, I saw 2 older gentlemen in golf attire. Wait, was it? could it possibly be? It was President Ronald Reagan and his golf buddy for the day, Walter Annenberg. In all of my interview prep and planning, I don't know why it had never occurred to me that I might actually meet President Reagan. I didn't know what to do. I kind of panicked, and so I thought about what I would do if the flag were passing by. So I stood up straight, placing my hand over my heart, staring nobly and non-threateningly off into the distance. I am certain I looked completely ridiculous. But typical Ronald Reagan, instead of walking past me, he walked straight toward me. He looked me in the eye and extended his hand. I shook his hand and introduced myself. Well, hello, Peggy. It's nice to meet you, said the 40th President of the United States of America. I had imagined him as a 10-foot-tall giant. After all, he had been a movie star, a governor, and President of the United States. He had tackled communism head-on, fixed the domestic economy, and solved many of the world's problems. And yet here he was, an ordinary man, just over 6 feet tall. His hair in pictures appeared jet black, but up close I saw touches of gray, evidence of his 78 years. He was ruddy and rosy-cheeked and full of life and happiness and vitality. His smile was more asymmetrical than I had ever noticed in photographs, and yet it was perfect in its imperfect way. And those eyes, a wonderful bright true blue and carrying so much joy. He was gone as quickly as he appeared, taking all the people, the energy, and the aura of power and importance with him. The office was suddenly eerily still. Selena, the woman who had interviewed me, then walked through that same door, grinning ear to ear, having witnessed my ridiculous salute. It's pretty incredible meeting him for the first time, isn't it? You should have warned me, I said, still trembling inside. No, it's much better this way. And though I felt I had horribly embarrassed myself, I had to agree. She then handed me the parking validation stickers and said I was going to wait until tomorrow to call you and leave you hanging in suspense for at least a while. But I already know that we want you to work with us here. So can you start on Monday? Yes, I could. I held it together until I was outside the building. I didn't know whether to shout for joy, cry, or drop to my knees in prayers of thanksgiving. I was so overwhelmed by all that had just happened that I started laughing out loud. The preposterousness of it all, me, him, this office, Fox Plaza, Avenue of the Stars. We had met, he shook my hand, and now I work for him? I had no idea what Monday would hold, but I knew with confidence my life would never be the same after that day, and in fact, it had already changed. So that's a little peek inside the pages of the book, and what a fascinating process this has been writing this book. And actually, I have to credit your president, Abraham Lincoln, for part of this book, because I've traveled and spoken all over the nation and the world sharing stories of President Reagan. And for many, many years, people would come up to me afterwards and they'd say, oh, you have to write a book. And my standard reply was, oh, I don't think I'd ever write a book, because when you're given a position of closeness and proximity, there's something very personal and almost sacred about that, and I just wasn't sure how I felt about telling my story from such a close proximity. But after I'd spoken once in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club, the head of the Presidential History Project out of the University of Virginia came up to me and asked me that question. You must write a book. And I gave him the same stock answer, and he said something that completely changed my perspective. And he said, if there was a woman who sat outside Abraham Lincoln's office door every day for 10 years, don't you think we would want to know what she saw, what she observed, what she learned, how it changed her life? And don't you think she would owe it to history to tell us? I was a little convicted. I still wasn't going to write a book, but just through a crazy set of circumstances a few years later, it became clear that that was my path of what I was supposed to do. So I hope in the pages of the book that you will find that you can see the president and that he is there and accessible to see you now as well. So we're not going to talk politics. Are we all right with that? Are we all saturated with politics? All right, we're not going to go there at all. But we are going to look a little bit at what leadership looks like at the highest and best, and how Ronald Reagan was such a great example of how to lead and how to live a life of integrity, of patriotism, of inspiration, all the way to the end of his life. Okay, we're amongst friends. We can laugh at the hairstyles and the fashions of the 80s and 90s. It's okay. I'm confident in it. I have a son and 3 daughters, and now I actually have a daughter-in-law, and especially my daughters kind of cringe, like, Mom, you wore that to the office? A sweater with shoulder pads? Welcome to the 1990s, yes. But my job ran the spectrum. I started working for him in 1989. I was hired, as you heard, to work as an intern. I thought if I worked for him for 3 months, it would be the most exciting 3 months of my life as I was graduating from college. Fortunately, at the end of college, I was offered a full-time staff position. I started working for the chief of staff as his executive assistant. He now serves as the publisher of the Washington Post. So somebody that I learned a lot from, taught me how to be a very good executive assistant. And then Ronald Reagan's longtime executive assistant who had served him before he was governor retired. And they asked me to take that job. No small task, but one I was honored and thrilled to be asked to do. So my job ran the spectrum, everything from the glamorous to the not so glamorous, interfacing with Buckingham Palace or the White House, to making sure the president had cash in his pocket if he wanted to get his hair cut, or toothpaste in his bathroom if he wanted to brush his teeth. Post-presidency, there was a small staff. There was hundreds that worked for him in the White House, and just a handful of us that worked for him post-presidency. And so I really got a great chance to interact with this man closely and personally over the course of the decade from 1989 to 1999 when he left the public eye. One of the things I love about Ronald Reagan is there were not two Ronald Reagans. I know a lot of people put him on a pedestal. He's one of those few people that you admire from afar, that when you met him in person, he was probably even better than you had imagined. Unfortunately, there's so many people we admire from afar, and sometimes we meet them, and aren't they sometimes a disappointment? That never was the case with Ronald Reagan. He was more charming, more warm, more gracious. Yes, ladies, he was more handsome in person. It's all right, my husband said, if I have to play second fiddle to somebody, it might as well be Ronald Reagan. But I loved the fact that his private and his public persona, there was no disconnect. I got to see when the cameras weren't rolling, when he thought nobody was watching, what he was really like. And I was always watching. And so it's just been a great pleasure and honor to share what it was like behind the scenes with Ronald Reagan. So looking back on my 10 years with him, it's interesting because when I went to write the book, I was trying to think, what are the moments that really stand out? And you would think it would be the star-studded, black-tie, celebrity, world leader type events. And actually, when I really looked into my heart, it was those ordinary days, if you could call any day with the president ordinary, where this ordinary girl had wound up at the feet of this extraordinary man, and how even though I was very young and he was very elderly, we together found a great way to work together to accomplish things and to have a lot of fun and success along the way. Of course, there were historic signatures I witnessed, extraordinary opportunities. In fact, there's Selena and I in front of the Forbes jet. Paul, they're down over there. We're very Christmassy in the red and the green. But this was on the Forbes jet flying. There are moments that I look back on and think, how on earth did I get to fly private aircraft with Ronald Reagan, ride in Secret Service-driven motorcades? I almost look back at my pictures and pinch myself and say, was this all a dream, or was this really happening? And what a privilege to be part of that. One of my favorite roles was, though, being behind the lens of the camera all those post-presidency years. Again, we all wore lots of hats, and so if you came to President Reagan's office for a meeting or for a lunch, I would probably greet you in the front. I would brief you on the meeting. I would bring you in and introduce you to the president. I'd snap your pictures. In fact, there's a woman here who came to the office and has a picture that I snapped. If you were having lunch, I would bring in your lunch. And at the end of the meeting, I would clear your dishes. So it was just a wonderful opportunity to have all these roles, but I did love being behind the lens of the camera. First of all, he made me look like a great photographer because he never took a bad picture. It had to have been that acting ability in him. But it was fun because I got to be the ultimate fly on the wall. You think about, how do we get photos of private meetings? When everybody leaves, the photographer gets to stay. And so what a great opportunity in this book to be able to share some photos that have never been published of his post-presidency years with world leaders and ordinary Americans. And in fact, this cover photo I snapped one day. I walked into his office, and he always looked very handsome, but there was something about this day that was just extra special. I think it was the way the sun was coming in through the window. He was wearing this little polka dot tie, which I'd never seen before, and he's got a golden California bear tie tack, and there was just something about this moment that almost took my breath away. And I walked in and I said, "Mr. President, you look especially handsome today. Do you mind if I take your picture?" Well, all right, you know. So I went and grabbed my camera, snapped this picture, and yes, I'll admit how old I am because it was back in the days of film cameras. So I snapped one picture, sent it off to the lab, got it back, you know, a week or two later, and just loved the photo so much. I had it enlarged. You never say with Secret Service around that you had a photo blown up. You always say enlarged. I had the photo enlarged, and it hung above my desk for all the years that I worked there because I thought it just captured him so beautifully in those post-presidency years, warm and welcoming as if he's waiting to see you. And so when I delved into this book writing process, I said, I have no idea what word one or title is going to be, but I know what photo I want on the cover. So how fun to not only have authored a book, but also to have a cover photo that I think captures him in those post-presidency years so beautifully. So behind the lens of the camera, I got to capture moments like this. Here he is touring Margaret Thatcher and Mrs. Reagan through his own presidential museum, which I'm sure a few of you have been to in Simi Valley. So moments before these big formal black tie events like this. And then I also got to capture moments like this after the event. If you can see, the ladies have their shoes kicked off in their stocking feet, and President Reagan has his eyes rolled in the back of his head like, stop talking so we can go home. So these were real people, and it was so fun to catch them in just those ordinary moments where everybody can relate to a picture and a moment like this. Ronald Reagan really changed my mind, especially as a young person, of what true diplomacy looks like. And Ronald Reagan's version of diplomacy looked a lot like relationships and not like rhetoric, and it didn't look political, it looked very personal. And we saw post-presidency this parade of people come from all over the world to pay tribute to him and to visit with him on a personal and social level, not because they had to for protocol and diplomatic reasons, but because they wanted to. They had a relationship with him that had begun either in his presidency, some of them even before that they really wanted to continue. And so from around the world they came. People like General Secretary Gorbachev, Prime Minister Nakasone from Japan, Chancellor Helmut Kohl from Germany, Prime Minister and Mrs. Brian Mulroney from Canada, President Lech Walesa from Poland, even Mother Teresa came from Calcutta, India. He changed my mind of what diplomacy really looks like, and diplomacy looks a lot like friendships, and how wonderful to see that at a young age. There was an authenticity about Ronald Reagan. He loved the pomp and circumstance of being president, but he also loved being up at his ranch in Southern California and would take people up there, like Margaret Thatcher. I don't think she quite owns ranch attire. Definitely did not come ready to ride out on the open range, but President and Mrs. Reagan, you can tell, were very comfortable and at home there. Here he is with Brian Mulroney bouncing around the back of a Secret Service beat up old Suburban. Here he is with Mrs. Mulroney at the bottom, and I love that bottom photo because I was overhearing the ladies as they were talking, and Mrs. Mulroney, who's this very beautiful, very fashionable woman, leaned over to Mrs. Reagan and she said, well, Nancy, aren't you so cute and trendy in your boot-cut jeans? And she looked down and she said, these old things? I've been wearing these since the last time they were in fashion. Some of us can relate. I tell my kids every now and then, I throw something on and I say, this jacket is older than you are. But anyway, it's great to see that friendship. Of course, when Gorbachev came to the ranch, this was a great picture. That's actually Reagan is driving the Jeep. That's Gorbachev riding shotgun. His very nervous Secret Service agent is in the back with Gorbachev's interpreter. This man, when he was behind the wheel, you wanted to get off the road. He had not driven in 8 years, and so it was a little bit of a nail-biting time. But when Gorbachev was going to be visiting the ranch, one of my interesting tasks was he was going to give Gorbachev a cowboy hat. And so it seemed like a very straightforward assignment until I said, got to thinking about it. What size cowboy hat does Gorbachev wear? And back in the day, when you couldn't exactly email or Google it or anything like that, I would wait in the office until about 10 o'clock at night, till it was 8 o'clock in the morning in Moscow, call, hoping to find somebody who spoke a little bit of English, taking, back in the day of faxes, drawing a picture of a cowboy hat with an arrow and a question mark and a band, and trying, if any way, to get this hat size for Gorbachev so I could get the right hat for him. Finally, I get a number back and it's 60-something, and I'm thinking, that's not a hat size. And again, I couldn't exactly Google, convert Russian hat sizes to Western hat sizes. So I went to an equestrian center, which in and of itself is a feat to find in Los Angeles. Finally got a hat size, went and found a hat for Gorbachev, very nervous, hoping that it was actually the size. Ronald Reagan presents this hat to Gorbachev. He puts it on. You can tell the hat fits perfectly. I was very proud of myself. But my celebration was very short-lived because the next day Stetson called the office and said, "While we love that you featured our hat so prominently, do you know he put it on backwards?" It was out of my hands by then, but for those of you who know Ronald Reagan's story, you know he came from very humble beginnings. We picture him as president, and yet he came from very humble beginnings, right here in central Illinois. And what I love about Ronald Reagan is that was never something he felt like he needed to overcome. I think he looked at the way he was raised and the foundation here in central Illinois as the foundation for everything he ultimately would become. He was born in 1911 in the middle of a snowstorm to a family that was very, very poor. His father was an alcoholic, and if you looked at the cards of life he had been dealt, you would have probably thought, this poor kid never has a chance. He'll never amount to anything. But he had a different plan, and God had a different plan for him as well. And I wanted to read you a quote that Ronald Reagan himself said about our other president here, President Lincoln, because I think that they had shared so much in common with their background, and you'll know why I picked this quote in a moment. Of course, Ronald Reagan never started just straightforward. He always had to tell a joke or a story, and so, of course, Ronald Reagan in this speech says, "Well, now we've gathered here to celebrate the life of Abraham Lincoln, and I suppose I'd better point out that despite what you may have heard, it's not true that Honest Abe and I went to school together." He goes on to say, Abe Lincoln was born in 1809 in a log cabin in the western wilds of Kentucky and spent his entire youth and boyhood in poverty, in frontier places where men hewed endless trees, forcing the forest with their own muscles to give up its poor land for crops, where women cooked over open fires and washed their clothes in creeks. Formal education was impossible, but young Lincoln pored over the few books he could find, studying the Bible in particular, probably the only book his family actually owned. And I'm sure you must have heard that sitting by the open fire as a boy, he would work out arithmetic problems with a piece of charcoal on a wooden shovel that was there by the fireplace. One important lesson that the life of Abraham Lincoln has to teach us is you don't have to be rich to love learning and to make something of yourself. And I think he looked at that great connection with Lincoln and again never saw something as his upbringing as something he needed to overcome, but the very foundation for everything he ultimately became. He always gave credit, of course, to God, but also to his mother. His mother was a great Christian woman, a woman of optimism and faith, who raised him to believe that God has a plan for everyone, and seemingly random twists of fate are all part of his plan, and in the end, everything will work out for the best. You can tell that regardless of your circumstances, if you were raised by a mother like that, how you can wind up being Ronald Reagan. And as much as we knew him, of course, as the great communicator, I think we also looked to him as the great optimist. There's a few people in this room who probably remember the 1970s. If you do, you remember taxes were high, inflation was high, unemployment was high, but worst of all, American morale was incredibly low. Ronald Reagan took office, and on day one, what did he start saying? It's morning in America. There's a new dawn ahead. There's a shining city on the hill, and we all get to be part of it. America's best days are yet ahead. In reality, not much was different in America on day one. And yet with optimism, and eventually with a successful plan of action, it changed everything. And if you asked Ronald Reagan at the end of his presidency what he was most proud of, it was not things he did or things he accomplished. He would say, I made the American people believe in themselves again. He was a great optimist. We were so eager to believe in ourselves again and believe in America, and he helped us do that. He was a man of incredible humility, which seems ironic for somebody who holds the highest office not only in the land, but arguably the most powerful office in the world. And yet he kept a sign on his desk that said there's no limit to what a man can do and where he can go, so long as he doesn't mind who gets the credit. That was not just a sign on his desk. That was the way he lived his life and was pretty much the way he expected those of us around him to serve as well. There was little things he did to show that this was a great man of awareness and appreciation and humility. Little things like reaching over and holding my elbow as we would go up and down stairs, which I thought was especially sweet since I was in my 20s and he was in his 80s, reaching over and steadying me as we would walk up and down stairs. And one of my favorite moments was early in the office, my office time there, we had set up his office for a big meeting and brought in a bunch of extra chairs and things, and at the end, one at a time, I was carrying these big, heavy wooden and leather chairs back to our conference room. And on one of my trips back and forth, I felt like somebody was following me, and I turned around, and sure enough, there was Ronald Reagan carrying a chair behind me. And I stopped and I said, "It's okay, Mr. President, I'll come back and get that." He put it down and he looked at me and he said, "What makes you think you can carry a chair any better than I can?" I said, "Okay, right this way." But just somebody who was always willing to jump in, step up, and help out, and just a great man of humility. He also had a great sense of humor. He used humor very strategically. Sometimes it was to make an important point, and he would do it in a way that was usually quippy and funny. He also used humor to put people at ease. You can imagine when people came to visit him, they were always very, very nervous, and so using humor would give him a way to help people relax. And as much as he took his role seriously, he never took himself too seriously, and that was a great, very endearing quality that people saw in him. He had great respect for presidents that came before him and presidents that came after him, regardless of party. He felt the importance of the office. He knew that he was a temporary steward of that office and felt the weight and the continuum of history, knowing that his footprint there was important, but that it was part of a larger story, and it wasn't an office that he owned, but he was just a temporary caretaker, and so was very respectful of the office of the presidency overall. He also had great respect for women. He talks about his mother as being the most important person in his early life. Of course, we know his incredible respect for Mrs. Reagan, the way he treated her. He respected Mother Teresa, this little tiny woman that he considered to be a giant on the world stage. And of course, he was most proud for being the president who put the first woman on the Supreme Court, and that was always something he was very, very proud of. He also was a man of incredible patriotism. Now, while that's something you would expect out of a president, it was something that came truly from his soul. And again, I got to see him at moments where he didn't think anybody was watching. The press wasn't there. The cameras weren't rolling. On birthdays or special occasions, we would invite people in to entertain him or perform for him. And inevitably, for a president, what do? Patriotic music. And so you would see him tapping his toe in time, singing along to every word, words to verses I didn't even know existed. He knew every word. Sometimes you'd see him stand out of respect. Sometimes you would look over and even see his eyes misting over with tears as he sang of our beloved America. He loved this country. I think he actually bled red, white, and blue. He was such a patriot. And he would even joke with Mrs. Reagan that there was another woman in his life. And he would talk about Lady Liberty as being that other woman. He was a man of immense gratitude. Here he is receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Bush in the White House. I snapped this photo on the plane on the way home, and it was a long flight from DC back to LA. And what I love about this, he took his coat off, but he left his medal on. Here's a man who's received every award, every medal, every trophy, every gold sticker and certificate. He always wins, right? He's the president. And yet it meant something to him. He never took for granted the blessing and the privilege of having been able to serve as president. And so this meant something to him. Also, what's he doing in this photo? Can you tell? We're on the way home from Washington, D.C. He takes pen to paper himself and is writing a letter thanking President Bush for the opportunity and the honor. Here's a man, of course, he had an assistant. I would have been happy to do that for him tomorrow. But he wanted to say what he wanted to say when he wanted to say it. And what a great example of discipline and living a life of complete gratitude. And as much as I love this picture, it actually kind of curses me too, because I fly and travel all the time. And so every time I get on the airplane, as much as I want to take a nap or do other things, I pull out my note cards and I sit and I write them first, because I think if this man can do it, I certainly can do it as well. One of my favorite gifts that I received over the years, you can imagine, when kings and princes and everybody came to visit, they would usually bring a little gift. I don't think it was a bribe. You know, it was post-presidency, so it didn't matter, but everybody was very good to the gatekeeper of the president. But my most treasured item I've received over the years was this, and if you can see, it's on gold embossed stationery. It says Ronald Reagan at the top. It's a cowboy doodle. I like to think maybe it was a self-portrait. And it says, "Merry Christmas to Peggy, Nancy, and Ronald Reagan." He gave this to me for Christmas one year, and as he presented it to me, he was a little bit apologetic, and he said, "Peggy, I wanted to do something more for you for Christmas, but you know you do all my shopping." And I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do something for you without involving you. Pre-Amazon Prime, pre-drone delivery, and so he took pen to paper and wrote this and presented it to me. And there's nothing I would treasure more. It's from his pen, from his heart, and such a great expression of gratitude to me. The world knew him for so many things. I knew him as a man of incredible kindness. This looks like a prom picture, but it's actually when I told him that that I had just gotten engaged to my husband, Greg, and so he was celebrating with us. I actually got married and had 3 of my 4 children while I was working for him. He was very patient through all those very challenging years, but was there to welcome my first, my son Taylor, my second, my daughter Courtney, my third, my daughter Paige, my fourth, my daughter Jocelyn. At which point one day Mrs. Reagan grabbed me by the arm, pulled me into the outer hallway of the office, and she said, "Peggy, you know how this is happening, right?" Not a conversation I wanted to have with the former First Lady or anybody, but for and no more. But over the course of the years, my kids had incredible opportunities to interact with the Reagans, and what I loved about their interaction with the Reagans is kids don't know or care if you're the president or if you're important or what your title is or how much money you're worth. Kids know one thing: do you like them? And do you care about them? And my kids knew that Ronald Reagan and Mrs. Reagan as well loved them and cared about them. And what a great opportunity for my kids literally to grow up with these incredible people and to have such a personal relationship and to be welcomed into their home and swim in their pool. And one of my favorite moments is looking over at the Los Angeles Zoo, and there's Ronald Reagan pushing my son in the stroller, flanked by United States Secret Service. Kind of crazy. But for the kids, it was all very normal. I have taught my son better manners, but on the far side, he jumped up on the desk because he said he wanted to give the president a real hug, not a leg hug, because when you're 2, it's like right around the knees. So he climbed up on the desk and gave the president a hug, and you can tell the president does not mind. But for the kids, it was all very normal. They would look at me dressed up in the evening, and my son would say, "Mommy, are you having dinner tonight with Daddy or the president?" And back pre-9/11, my husband would drive out on the tarmac to drop me off as we were flying off to someplace, and Taylor, my son, would sit on the hood of the car, and before President Reagan boarded the plane, he would always make a little turn and come over and say hello to Taylor. So really special that my kids grew up with these incredible people. Now, to make you further jealous, my husband, any golfers in here? Actually got to play golf with President Reagan fairly regularly. As the president's friends got older, some of them stopped playing golf or would go to the desert for the weekend, and so every now and then on Friday afternoon, the phone would ring. And the first time I was a little worried about it because it was Mrs. Reagan, and she called to ask for my husband, Greg. I was wondering what they were conspiring about. But of course, Greg agreed on the phone and then hung up, and he said, "Peggy, Mrs. Reagan asked if I would please be Ronnie's 4th for tomorrow, and so as much as I would love to do the honey-do list of chores tomorrow, and I couldn't wait to mow the lawn, duty calls. I must go serve my country. I must go play golf with Ronald Reagan." So over the course of the years, my husband got to play golf with President Reagan countless times, and what a great experience for him to be out on the golf course. And I have to say, some of the stories he would come back with, I would look at him and think, the president said that? Because he was very respectful, always in front of women, but out on the golf course, you know, maybe there were a few stories that I had not heard in the office. But a great opportunity for him as well. And really everything I ever needed to learn about how to lead and how to live, I learned from this man, and not from a list of things he gave me, but just by how he lived his life. And one of the greatest takeaways from his life is that your legacy is not written after you're gone. It's written with every single day of your life. And for all of us, what a great reminder that we should live and we should lead and live as if our legacy depends upon it, because it does. I got to see Ronald Reagan's legacy play out every single day, behind the scenes in the office when he thought nobody was watching, and I always was. Every day when he stepped out into the world and we would see how the world interacted with him, he was writing the legacy of his life. Out of all the 10 years that I served for him, there's a couple of moments that really stand out when you think about all of them, that he was writing the legacy of his life and had a front row seat to watch it. One, there was a little boy who was suffering with the effects of autism. He had Asperger's syndrome. He had memorized every single fact about Ronald Reagan, and his family had written into the office and asked if he could come in and see him. And so they came in, and of course the parents were very, very nervous, but I told them, don't worry about it, the president will be great with him. And to watch this little boy kind of quizzing Ronald Reagan about his life, and sometimes telling the president, no, you got that wrong, that's not what it said in the book I read. And watching this sweet, sweet interaction between this little boy and this elder statesman, Ronald Reagan was writing the legacy of his life by the way he lived. There was a Secret Serviceman that came in who had stood post outside Ronald Reagan's office door every day for 8 years. Had never really met him except for a receiving line, and wrote in, asked for an opportunity to meet with him. So of course we agreed. And as he came in, he said, Mr. President, it was such a privilege to stand outside your bedroom window every night, because I knew if I protected you during the night and if you could get a good night's sleep, you would be able to make better decisions for our country the next day. Thank you so much for the opportunity to serve you. And to watch President Reagan thank this man for his service as he was thanking the president for his. There was a military man who had been shot down behind enemy lines, who had survived by eating bugs and leaves until he was rescued. And Ronald Reagan had read about his story and brought him into the office and asked for an opportunity to meet him. And there was this beautiful exchange, and even though this man wanted to honor President Reagan, it was clear on that day that President Reagan intended to honor him. And at the end of this meeting, the man looked at President Reagan and he said, I know you're no longer my commander-in-chief, but if it's all right, I would really like to salute you. And President Reagan said, I'm no longer your commander-in-chief, but if it's all right, I would love to salute you back. And so to watch these two men stand facing each other toe-to-toe at the foot of President Reagan's desk in full salute to each other was just a beautiful moment. He was writing the legacy of his life with every single day that he served. Out of all those 10 years, there's one appointment that stands out in my mind more than any. I don't remember the date. I don't even know the woman's name. But I'll never forget the moment she walked in. She was a very tiny, very stooped over, very elderly woman from Romania. And she walked in, she had written to the office and asked for the opportunity to meet President Reagan. And as she walked in, she took one look at Ronald Reagan and she dropped to his feet. And she started sobbing and kissing his feet. She couldn't even get herself together for words. And the president looked down and eventually brought her to stand. And with tears streaming down her face in her very broken English, she looked up at President Reagan and thanked him for freeing her and her family and freeing her people from oppression. Somehow this woman in Romania had traced the dots of her freedom back to the feet of this man. And I thought of all the people all around the world, if they had had the same opportunity to walk into that office and had seen Ronald Reagan, would have also fallen to his feet and thanked him for their freedom. Ronald Reagan was writing the legacy of his life with every single moment of it. And of course, we remember when he passed away, the outpouring of affection and respect from across the nation and around the world. Here was a man that most people had never even met personally, and yet somehow he had meant something to them. They had connected to him. They felt like he was somebody who was important in their life. And I would think that it's because they knew that they were always important to Ronald Reagan. There's so many things we loved about Ronald Reagan, but I think in essence, we loved Ronald Reagan because we loved ourselves and we loved America when he was president. And it's been an incredible opportunity and honor to share with you my stories, to serve him for so many years. And I'm happy to take a few questions, and then I'll end with a closing passage. So thank you.